So ko Kimonda aho. My name is Kim, and I'm looking forward to keeping you all connected to the life-changing research that you're supporting. Thank you for empowering talented, amazing scientists like we've got here today who are changing the future of health for your whānau and family. So tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to introduce Professor Nick Draper in a minute. I'll just give you a quick rundown for those. There is a few new people here who may not be aware. It used to be 1 in 5 New Zealanders are affected by neurological conditions, but now it's 1 in 3 with the research that's come out. And for those supporters who get the headlines, you'll see that in your edition next week as to how those numbers have come close. In the last 5 years, thanks to you all, the foundation has committed 30 million, which is quite a feat, and that's to support over 700 complex neurological conditions when it comes to improving the research. And as you know, it's all because of you, because there's no government funding. And some of the highlights we've got here is with the Human Brain Bank, and that is in Auckland at the university there for brain research, and we're committed to that for another 5 years. There's also the Chair of Neurology and Fellowship. The loyal supporters will know Alan Barber, who's done incredible work in stroke rehabilitation. So that's also where your support's going. And so this year we're looking to raise another $5.5 million to support more groundbreaking research. And here we go. You can read about these talented gentlemen up here, but I'll get Nick Draper to come and let you all know where it's at. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, pai ki te kita ia koutou, te rangi, te whenua, te iwi, te whare, tēnā koutou. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you, echoing the words, just thank you so much for all the support you give to the Neurological Foundation, and thank you to the Neurological Foundation for supporting our research. Without the generosity and support that we've received, we wouldn't have been able to start this research, and it's been a fantastic journey for us and really exciting. For researchers that are sort of looking at our research and listening in, I'd just say, a thank you to the reviewers that look at applications within the Neurological Foundation. We weren't successful with our first grant application, and the review process was the best of any funder in New Zealand in regard to feedback about where there were mistakes in our research and what might help improve it. And we used that, followed that, and we were successful with our second application. So thank you very much for a fantastic review process. We've got a catchy title, and then the project, this is academics, isn't it? With our longer title, which we had for the project. And that's around measuring peak linear accelerations and looking at the potential of headgear to reduce those peak linear accelerations. Now, this is my favourite team selection. I know they're talking about now 5 or 6 weeks until they name the next All Blacks coach. That I haven't got any news on that, but I can with something from Facebook anyway. The World Animal 11, or 15, sorry. The World Animal 15 has recently been named or circulated around. And as a fan of Ethan Blackadder, who plays for the Crusaders, I think the silverback at 6 is very aptly chosen. This is our project team, and it's a project that's grown. This is about 10 years in the making. And it's a project that's grown in terms of the team, but also in terms of the wonderful support. And the latest additions are Lincoln Rugby Football Club, High School Old Boys, and Christchurch Girls High that are going to be the participants in our research in this second year of the study. So, wonderful team broken down into those that are sort of neurocognitive and MRI specialists, the field data collection team, and then also the engineering team. And Daniel's really lucky tonight as one of the engineering team because he has an office with no windows and he doesn't get out a lot, so it's really nice for him to be outside. Our philosophy as a research team, first of all, we're focused on children. And that's where our research is. And our main goal is around, can we make a sport that's got some wonderful parts to it, can we make it safer for children? So that's where we've been focused. And our goal overall is to assess collisions and then look at potential of some headgear that's been manufactured recently in regard to reducing the magnitude of collisions. And that's created 4 objectives. So we've got the incidents. How many collisions do players experience during a game? What are the size or magnitude of those collisions? What do they look like? And then the potential of headgear to reduce those. And lastly is to look at any effects on cognition as a result of a season playing rugby or a concussion during the season. So we had ethical approval, obviously important in terms of research. So we had that and made sure that was in place. But we also had a whole series of processes to go through from New Zealand Rugby down in the Medical Scientific Advisory Panel, all the way through to the clubs that we've been working with. And we're really grateful for everybody's support. Canterbury and Crusaders and Ellesmere Rugby Union in particular have been absolutely fantastic in terms of their openness and welcomeness for the research and supporting what we're doing. I'm going to provide an update and I'm going to hand over to, just to kind of where we've got to and what the plans are for 2023. Then I'm going to hand over to Stefan, who's going to talk about the results from this year and this first year of data collection. And then he's going to hand over to Daniel, who's going to talk about what we do with the data and how we explore it. So we had 2 teams in the first year, and we had 21 that completed the study males, and we had 18 females that completed the study. And that was almost 100% recruitment. And so a really big thank you to the parents and the players who were involved last year, and an advanced thank you to those players who hopefully will be involved this year, because people have really gone on board with the study and been really excited to be involved and see the value of what we're doing. We've completed all our pre-season testing last year, and we've done our in-season measurement of collisions, and we've also completed all the post-season testing, and we're in the process of analysing, and Stefan initially will start to update on that and where we've got to. Our plans now moving forwards, we need 19 more players, male players, to finish the 40 that we want for the whole study for males, and then 22 females to complete the study. So that's what we're looking to recruit in this coming season. And we're starting with our information evenings next Wednesday and Thursday with both teams. And that will start, the season will start in, or we'll start the sort of data collection in March 23, and then the season starts in May. And we'll collect all the data through the season. So this is what we're doing, and I'm going to do it very briefly because the team are going to go through in more detail. But we're using really special instrumented mouthguards. They're made in Australia. We have Donna Batchelor's dentistry orthodontist who does the scans for us. She emails them over to Australia, and they then 3D print these wonderful mouthguards. And Stefan's got an example if people want to see it. And what we can do with it is get a trace of any collisions, which you can see with the middle graph. And then for a whole team, we can look at all the incidents of collisions across a game and across a season. So that's how we're measuring the peak linear and the peak rotational accelerations in collisions. And one of the projects we're doing, and Daniel will start to speak to this, is trying to connect what's called finite element modeling. So this is getting a picture of what's happening in the brain, and there are now fantastic models that are available that we can plug our mouthguard data into in order to analyse where the strain is on the brain when there's a collision. So that's a piece of work that the engineers are looking at for us and taking forwards. And so the data we've got from mouthguards is really helpful in terms of what else we can do with it. Then we have this headgear we've mentioned. So it's just really to highlight that. So we've had in the lab, and Daniel was part of a team that built a drop test rig a few years ago now. He's been with us for a long time and looking to escape after a PhD. They built a drop test rig. And with that, we can measure, with sensors in the head form, we can measure the collisions when they're on a drop test. And we've gone through a series of testing different types of headgear. So this is the traditional off-the-shelf headgear that you can buy. But more recently, under a law change, so that was Law 12, Rugby has a whole load of rules and regulations and laws. That was under Law 12, and it has real specifications about what the headgear has to do and how it has to perform. But more recently, they've developed, a couple of companies have started to develop headgear that's slightly different, and it fits under a new category. N-Pro is the first headgear that's been approved by World Rugby for this process, and it fits under a Law 4 rugby headgear trial. And that's about headgear being seen as a medical device. Slightly different specifications, and what we wanted to know was what are the differences. So the first thing we did was test it in a lab. And what we've got here is just very quickly peak accelerations and then the head injury criterion score. So if we look at the peak accelerations to start with, this is drop testing from different heights. This is without the headgear on. And then down the bottom is the newer types of headgear. So if we look at a 71 from 238 down to a 42 average drop. So there is some degree of mitigation that appears in the laboratory. So that then became, because it's the only headgear that's been approved under this law trial, that's the headgear we've used for the study, and that's been offered to players to wear if they choose to. And then we've done our drop tests, and when we do a drop test on the rig, this is the kind of readout we get, and that's very similar in terms of that trace to the type of trace we can get from the mouthguard. So it means that we can do some comparison. And my last slide before I hand over is just what we're doing. We couldn't set up a study where we ran, a set of players that were in an experimental group wearing the headgear, and then a group that weren't wearing headgear as a control, because it would be ethically unsound. So what we're doing instead is looking at, if a player wears headgear, then we recreate the collision from the field. We recreate that in the lab with the headgear on. Then we take the headgear off, we do the drop again, and the difference between the two is the potential mitigation. And vice versa, if they've not got headgear during a collision, we can recreate that in the lab and then put the headgear on, do the drop again, and that again creates the idea in terms of the mitigation that's there. I'm going to hand over now to Daniel. To Stefan. Thank you.
All right, tēnā koutou. Thanks, Nick. Thanks so much to the Neurological Foundation for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. We're really excited to be presenting some initial findings and results from the 2022 season. So my name is Stefan. I'm one of the PhD students involved in the project. So basically my job is to follow one of the teams, as Nick said. So last season I followed a under-16 boys team throughout the whole season. And my colleague, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, was following an under-17 girls team. So essentially, as Nick said earlier, what we're measuring here, and this relates to the first two objectives, we're looking at the incidence and magnitude of the head impacts received by the players in one season. And we are able to report on some of the initial findings tonight from both the male and the female teams. So incidence is essentially the number of head impacts received in a set amount of time, and that could be a direct impact to the head, or it could be an impact that's elsewhere on the body where the acceleration is transferred to the head. And magnitude is the size of those impacts. So magnitude is measured in either peak linear acceleration, and that would be in g-forces, as Nick was just explaining. It could also be measured in radians per second squared for that rotational acceleration. That gets a little bit complicated tonight. We're just going to focus on the g-forces and what those mean and what impact they can have on the players. And later on we'll talk in a little bit more detail and some practical terms about sort of what that means. And part of my role as well is to look at that objective 4 of the study. So this is where we're looking at brain function. So we had the players complete pre- and post-season neurocognitive testing and pre- and post-season MRI scans, which look at a very comprehensive protocol, and it looked at a variety of brain activity. So essentially what we're doing there is we're looking to see if there's been any change pre to post season after these guys and girls have played a season of rugby, whether there's been any change in brain function based on those outcomes, and whether that change can be correlated with receiving more or bigger impacts. Now this data is still being analysed, so we're not able to report on those findings tonight. So we'll get back to our incidence and magnitude. So we were able to measure the incidence and magnitude by using these very fancy mouthguards that you're welcome to have a look at some point tonight. And these are custom fitted mouthguards, so they've got a dental scan, and the players wore them at all games and at all training sessions that involved some sort of contact, like a tackle drill or something like that. The impacts are recorded by The impacts are recorded by 3 accelerometers embedded within them, so they were able to pick up all those impacts. And we set the threshold for the mouthguards at 8 Gs, and again, I'll explain a little bit more later on about sort of what that means, but that's a relatively low impact, and we set the mouthguards to record at that level and above, so we could capture sort of the maximum amount of data. All right, so once the mouthguards have recorded all these collisions for us, the crucial next step is to make sure, as much as we can, that the impacts being recorded by the mouthguards are real or not. So in order to do that, we have to import that data, see if I can get this to work, into a computer software. And at the same time, we import all the video footage that we had been shooting throughout the season. So we were filming at every training and every game, and we imported both of those things together to the software package. So what you can see here, sort of in the bottom right, that's a representation of all the impacts for one game. So each green dot represents one collision. So what we do is we line up the particular impact that we're looking at with the video footage. And you can see here that this is 2 video angles of the same event. So often we were able to have more than one angle, which improved our accuracy. Hopefully it did. And so once we look at an impact and we decide, okay, that is real or it's not real, we can verify it as yes or no. So we have this coding window up here that I know is very small, but here our yes and no buttons are up here on the top left. And then once we've clicked on that, then we can add a whole bunch more descriptors to that event in order to get more detail on it, such as what was happening. Was it in a tackle? Was the impact against the ground? Was it against the opposition? And so on. All right. Now, once we had gone through that process for every game and every training, for every player for the entire season, which was a lot, this is what we're able to show you guys tonight. So this is our incidence data for the entire season. So these are team averages. This is not per player. I just want to make that clear. So what you can see here is it's separated by females and males. In terms of the training sessions and the number of games, you can see that that's sort of roughly equivalent. So there's a range of about 13 to 17 sessions that were experienced by the players throughout the season. And of course, the main thing to point out here is that there are far more impacts in games versus training, and that is probably not surprising. You can also note that the boys tended to have slightly more impacts than the girls in games, and what that leads us to on the right-hand side here is a total impacts. On average, the boys experience 125 impacts per game, whereas the girls experience 97. Now, again, I just want to emphasize that that is not per player, that's for the whole team. Okay? All right, now embedded within all of those impacts, we had 2 verified concussions for the season. So that was 1 for a female player and 1 for a male player. The thing about concussion is it's a tricky thing to rate. Often what research studies will do is that they'll have the concussion rate within a certain amount of time. So in this case, it's per 1,000 match hours, and you end up with this number. And the number's a little bit meaningless, but that's why I put it up here to compare it to other studies. So these, I want to be clear, are studies that only look at junior rugby. So it's the same sport and roughly the same cohort. So what you can see with these studies compared to our numbers is that our numbers, I know it's based on a small sample, but they are roughly, these are our numbers here, 3.74 for female, 3.38 for male. They're roughly comparable to those other studies. Note that the more recent studies do have higher numbers. And it should also be pointed out that the higher level of rugby, you go up to the professional elite level, you probably get a higher rate of concussion. So this is again just for the juniors. Also want to point out that concussions in our study per our protocol need to be verified by a medical doctor. You can see that is the case in most of those other studies as well. It is worth noting that the one here with the asterisk, the Kerr study, they did not have trained medical staff for a majority of their sessions to verify concussions. And it's also worth noting that that's the study with the lowest rate of concussion reported. So following on from that, just to look at some other sports, it's also useful to compare rugby with other youth team sports. So now we're looking outside of rugby, but we're still in the same age group, roughly. And this is one study that used the same formula for all of their concussion rates. And you can see that rugby does tend to be highly represented relative to other team sports in terms of concussion rates. The comparable one on this particular study is American football, which is probably not surprising. You can note here that the female rate is quite a bit higher than the male in this particular study. And I did put our study numbers there on the right again, just as a comparison. It can be tricky to compare overseas sports as well. Sometimes, particularly in the US, they use different coding systems, so it can be difficult to compare concussion rates. But that's what we have so far. Now, in terms of magnitude, sort of the other thing that we're measuring, again, after looking at all of those, going through all that video software and all those impacts, this is, again, the average magnitude for the entire season, separated by males and females. And what you can see here is that it's actually generally consistent. So there's roughly the same magnitude in terms of peak linear acceleration being experienced by both genders and at both trainings and games. And what that leaves us with the total on the right is an overall average for the season of an impact of 21.1 Gs. All right. Now, if we can link this back to incidence, we might say that the boys received roughly the same magnitude impacts as the girls, but they just received more of them. And we might also potentially conclude that based on these results, that the intensity of the contact drills and training potentially roughly approximate the intensity of a game, because we've got roughly consistent results there. Okay, now just to explain a little bit more about what that G-force means, I think as I'm standing right here, I'm probably experiencing 1 Gs. So I put some examples there on the screen of some things you might experience or might not want to experience in terms of G-forces and what they might mean. And then on the left-hand side over here, I've put the range of magnitudes that we've found so far in our study. So our minimum magnitude is going to be 8 Gs, because that's what we told the mouthguard to measure. So there's going to be nothing below that. Our average magnitude of 21 Gs is what we just saw on the previous slide. And in terms of the upper limit of that range, the girls' maximum, so that means the single biggest impact experienced by a female player, was 96 Gs, and the single biggest impact experienced by a male player last season was 131 Gs. Now, in terms of what that means sort of in the wider research, and this is a big part of the reason why we're doing this study in the first place, is that there is a real lack of data currently on the incidence and magnitude of impacts experienced by junior rugby players, and even more especially by female rugby players. So there is a research gap there. We have some data on the screen, primarily from Doug King, who's a researcher here in New Zealand. He's done a lot of research on this. There are other studies looking at similar outcomes, one down in Otago, one up in Gisborne, to try to sort of fill that research gap. But what you'll see here are some relatively low numbers at the under 9 and under 11 level, so they're pretty young. but much higher numbers in the adult study here. Magnitudes are fairly similar. But I've added the column here on the right. This is what we've found in our study so far. Now, because those studies were measuring things slightly differently, I've changed the numbering here slightly. So what I mean here by the 6 per match is that this now is per player per match, okay? So that 6 means that in the average player, male or female, so far in our study, in the average game, so far, experiences around 6 head impacts per match. Now, they may not all be direct, but that's the number that we have so far. All right. So, again, linking this back to other sports, like sports other than rugby, we can see here that our study so far, we're going to put this on the left side. So in terms of incidence, and this is looking at a variety of research studies. The numbers in brackets underneath the name of each sport, that just reflects the number of studies that I'm quoting here. And from this table, you can see that our current average incidence is somewhat lower than the other rugby studies, than American football, but it's higher than soccer. And in terms of magnitude, again, we're looking at that 21 that we've got as an average so far. That so far is somewhat a little bit higher than rugby, but lower than American football, and sort of interestingly lower than soccer in terms of the magnitude. Yeah, all right. So of note here as well, some of these studies, again, were American and they were at college level. So some of the studies included a slightly older age in terms of, in comparison to our cohort. But of course, to interrogate this data more, we need more information. We're going to get a lot of data from this 2023 season, which is coming up rapidly. We need to get a little bit more detail about the findings that I've presented to you tonight. And obviously we need to add in that neurocognitive testing scores and the MRI scan results to see if any further relevant correlations can be found. All right, but I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over to Daniel.
Cool. Do you want to grab your... Cool. And... All right. Can everyone hear me? I'm just going to assume that means yes. So yeah, I'm Daniel. I'm the PhD student in mechanical engineering. And I'll be kind of going over my work going into exploring some more biomechanical solutions to mitigating concussions in rugby. So as I'm sure we're probably all aware by now, head impacts can cause mild traumatic brain injuries, or more commonly known as concussions. And this is because the rotational motion that's involved in a head impact induces quite a complex buildup of strain that travels through the brain, and at some level it can tear apart the neuronal tissues. Now in professional rugby, these head impacts are kind of monitored reasonably closely, but I'm sure most of you can appreciate most players aren't actually at the professional level, they're at a sub-elite level, where immediate access to this medical assessment isn't really available. This, among some other factors as well, leads to an estimated 50 to 90% of all mild brain injuries going undiagnosed and therefore untreated. So in terms of reducing the numbers of these injuries in rugby, there's only really 2 ways without changing the game too significantly. The first is rules and technique, such as lowering the tackle height to below the sternum. And the other one is implementing the use of protective equipment. Nick's already talked about how our very first study, we looked at the linear accelerations in the lab that headgear can protect from. More recently though, I've gone a bit deeper into it and looking at how headgear can mitigate the rotational motions. So up here, there's another graph for you all, showing the peak acceleration reached by an impact in the lab without any headgear on it at 3 different impact surface angles. The numbers on the side don't mean too much because what we found is that all headgear reduces peak linear and rotational accelerations to a pretty significant extent. with some of these newer generation headgear that Nick was talking about before doing a much better job. Unfortunately, in terms of whether or not this translates to the field, we don't really know. This is for a bunch of reasons, not for lack of trying. There's been a bunch of research into whether or not headgear can protect from concussion on the field, both in terms of incidence and head accelerations, but they all come back inconclusive. This is because a whole bunch of things really. Players just not wearing the headgear, because as Nick said, you can't force them to wear the headgear, and a whole lot of variables that you just can't really control for on the field. This is exacerbated by the fact that most researchers and standards authorities kind of want you to do all something different or do something different themselves. For example, World Rugby uses a steel head form and drops it onto a steel impact surface. Personally, I don't think this quite aligns with reality very well. And most researchers tend to agree. So just like us, we've used a rubber-coated head form and dropped it onto a rubber impact surface. But no one's actually bothered comparing this to to the impact conditions that exist on the field. And this is pretty much where I'm at the moment. So from here, my line of work splits into two main streams. The first is to compare the field and lab data and impact conditions to try and update the testing practices and get a better idea of how to align those two situations. And the second is to go through and develop a much deeper understanding of the link between biomechanics and brain strain, which you can see our little finite element model there. A little bit of background just quickly on impact testing in the lab. To carry out an impact test, we only really need to know 4 things: whether or not a neck is involved, the impact location, the drop height, and the impact surface angle. Obviously, knowing the impact surface itself would be pretty helpful, but we don't have enough data on that in the lab yet. So the first step was to find a way to immediately get information about an impact I know nothing about and recreate it in the lab. So using some funky little machine learning things, I was able to find all the parameters and all the features that would best predict all of these impact conditions in the lab, and then run through on our lab data set to see how well it performed. So overall, we can predict whether or not a neck's involved or should be involved with like 99% accuracy, impact location with 97% accuracy, drop height and impact surface angle with 96 and 93% respectively. As this last point says though, we haven't actually applied this to field data. It's only recently become available. And I haven't quite had a chance to go through and see how well it performs. I'd expect it to perform similarly just because of the way that I've actually run through this study. As I mentioned though, this tells us initial conditions or how to set up an impact, but it doesn't actually tell us how the resulting impact compares at all. To do this, I just need to bite the bullet and get a whole bunch of field data and run it through this algorithm, see what it says, recreate it in the lab, and then use a combination of time series comparison and 3D brain modeling to try and better align the two conditions. From this, I'll be able to hopefully infer the appropriate changes to the testing methods and update these for future use. This will hopefully allow us to be able to answer a lot of questions that are currently unknown about headgear, such as whether or not it can actually mitigate brain strain or impact severity under conditions that are typical to rugby. Now on to my second line of work. It's all well and good to understand how headgear behaves, but I'm quite interested in learning about whether there's some more biomechanical options that we can look through. So at the moment, I'm looking at how the specific kinematics, so directional accelerations and so on, relate to brain strain in different regions. You can, for those that aren't familiar with engineering terms, think of strain as stretching, and investigate how specific gameplay situations link to regional brain strains. The aim is to use this to see whether there's some changes in gameplay style that we can implement and whether or not these might actually be able to influence the strain levels and, by extension, the incidence of injury. So I've already carried this out on my laboratory data and found that the strain level and distribution is highly dependent on the impact location, and that the highest strains were found in the brainstem. Again, for those not familiar, that's right there, specifically at the front of the brainstem. And this is kind of interesting because most other studies implicate that the corpus callosum is the most damaged during concussive impacts, which is this part right here that bridges across both hemispheres of the brain. In our study, though, we found that it has, in almost all cases, some of the lowest strains, followed by the cerebellum, which is this kind of gross-looking part here. And that's kind of an interesting point. Not really exactly sure what that means yet, because we've only just recently found some of these. But yeah. Further looking into some of the field data and how some of these features influence brain strain, we've found that impacts to the side of the head may actually drive strain in the brainstem and corpus callosum much more than other types of impacts, and that different features better predict strain in different regions of the brain. So in the corpus callosum bit that I mentioned before, forgotten the name of it, the bit at the back that I mentioned before. Yeah, the gross bit. That's predicted by something different to what predicts strain in the brainstem and strain in the cerebral hemispheres. In the lab, these are pretty reasonably clear cut. On the field though, or field data, it's a lot messier and the links are a lot less prominent. And that's just because the field data is full of variation and all of that, different head sizes, impact surfaces, impact angles, and so on. And that's effectively where I'm up to at the moment. A lot of exploratory stuff, not too much to solid results to share, unfortunately. But then carrying on to the future, I aim to go a bit deeper into looking at how these complex relations of field variables, gameplay situations, relate to brain strain and also neurological outcomes, so also the neurocognitive testing that Stefan's doing, and some MRI data, which hopefully I'll get my hands on quite soon. And then use brain strain as a method to assess headgear designs, both new and current, and align laboratory testing with with reality. Yeah, cheers for listening. Thanks to all my supervisors and everyone who helps. And I think I'm passing it back to someone.
I'll go. We'll skip through, just in the interest of time. This is some other work that we're doing, but we could cover that another time, and then we'll go to questions, I think. Thank you very much for your time and listening.
Wonderful. So now's your opportunity to question these scientists and let them know what your thoughts are on this research. Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
The new head protection equipment, is that sort of any way related to the MIPS stuff that's in cycling and skiing helmets now, which is maximum impact protection system?
Not in terms of the design, so it's based on a foam-based or enclosed cell.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so foam-based, engineer will tell you a more comprehensive answer, but it's based on a foam-based type of approach in terms of that mitigation and not the same technology, which is the MIPS, which is that collapsing type of sliding movement. Do you want to say something more informative?
Yeah, MIPS is kind of like a gel stuff that lets the helmet slip over your head so that it doesn't, I believe it's so that it doesn't transfer the rotation that gets transferred to it during an impact. We don't really have a lot of thickness to work with in rugby. It's 10 mil thick. It might be a little bit hard to put a bunch of extra padding on with that. But yeah, the foams are pretty capable of deforming in that way though.
It does, I think it does. The question relates to one of the things that we've been looking at, and I think that World Rugby have their regulations around how headgear needs to behave. But if you put an engineer on designing a headgear and took away those regulations and said design something that would be most effective in terms of mitigating collision impact, peak linear accelerations and rotational forces, you might come up with a different design. And that might be, and you don't want something that's going to impact on the player in terms of how they play the game, but you might get a different answer and solution than we've currently got. And so I think that's something for the future, and it's certainly one of the other areas we're looking at in terms of research. If we could take headgear in a different direction and do something different with it, what would we do? And the MIPS idea and that sort of technology in the sliding is something we've been looking at.
Anyone else, Kate?
Who is it that has designed the headgear that's being recommended for use, and what were the criteria they used to come up with it?
Yeah, I can go. The one that's been recommended for use, or World Rugby approved, is called NPro. And that was made by someone that works at...
No, it's made by a company in Dublin.
Yeah.
And designed on, and they've sort of come up with a design to try and make it as breathable as possible, but then sort of take an idea in terms of some sort of, the maximum way with the number of layers to reduce the peak linear accelerations, and then they've tested it in laboratory conditions and had a paper published around that sort of research in terms of what they found. And then they went through a testing process with World Rugby that allowed them to have the first stamp of a headgear that performs and correctly under the new Law 4 trial.
Does wearing headgear change player behaviour at all, so that they think that I've got a headgear on, I'm bulletproof, and therefore that actually sort of nullifies the impact?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little. There's been a concern for that. The term that's used in the research is risk compensation, which is basically what you're saying. It's unclear, those findings. Like there have been some studies that have shown that perhaps that is a thing, that people will change their behaviour and become more reckless when they're wearing headgear, but there have been equally a number of studies that have shown that to not be the case. So yeah, sorry to sort of not give you an answer, but it's certainly been an idea that's been proposed, but the results are sort of unclear whether that's true or not. Yeah.
What we could say, probably in terms of the research so far, there's a lower number of players that have opted to wear headgear than you might guess because it was free. And then there are also different scenarios in terms of between males and females and usage, and also usage in different situations. So one of the things that made the research much more logistically difficult was the fact that the players in both teams played not only for a club side, but also for school. So we had a whole lot of other games to video as a result of that. And what you found was different behaviours and choices around when they were playing for school and for club, in terms of wearing headgear and not wearing headgear, and when parents were watching and not wearing. So and when parents were watching and not watching. So there are differences there. That was probably the biggest finding that we found so far, rather than a change in behaviour as a result of wearing. But that's anecdotal at this stage.
It's not compulsory. Headgear isn't compulsory.
In the study or in rugby?
Well, just in general.
In New Zealand, absolutely not. It's not compulsory at all. In Japan, junior players have to wear headgear. That's been mandated, and they wear that at the junior level. But that isn't the case here.
What criteria have you got in terms of determining an impact? And if so, is there a follow-up of that type of impact followed up after the injury may have occurred?
So are you referring to impacts that... Did you ask the question, sir? Okay, just want to see you were. So are you referring to impacts that result in injury?
Well, you're saying that you've got so many numbers of impact per team or whatever it is.
Yep.
There must be different criteria to determine what type of impact or what that was. Is that correct or not?
Yes, yeah, no, so absolutely. So remember all those little green dots?
Yep.
So every single one of those little green dots will tell us that incidence, it will tell us the magnitude. So it'll tell us the size of that impact. Whether it causes injury or not is a whole other thing that we're not really dealing with. But the impacts that resulted in the concussions, we do have the information that we can look up about those particular events. Yeah.
I think the thing that's important from that is that we're not collecting real-time data. So we're not sitting pitch side. The technology is not available, so that you could look at an impact at the moment and say, well, that's that one, and that relates to. So nobody's near that in terms of that potential to do that. So the analysis that Stefan has done has been post-season, and it requires a video verification to make sure that it's a real collision. So if the players take the mouthguard out and put it in their sock, you get a beautiful little pop-in trace as they go along. And so you have to do that video verification in order to then know about the size of the collisions. And the important thing, I think, as well, is that whilst there's that number of collisions, that's not that number of collisions with the head. That's the collisions and impacts they're involved in. And what we're measuring with accelerometers is change in speed, change in acceleration. So if they stop suddenly and they step wildly, you get a trace on the mouthguard. So that you're measuring that as opposed to something that's always direct with the head. And I look to my engineering friend.
Will your research lead us to, if you finding out in different players within the team, the area of impact is greater than, say, a prop versus a winger, will that carry through to, in the longer term, maybe looking at rules changing for rugby or impact sports, whatever it may be? Do you see that to be part of your research, or is it just around getting a helmet or a protective gear that's going to do a particular job?
The primary function of the research is to understand collisions in more detail. And then to look across a season in terms of changes in cognitive function. That's the main part of the research. The work in terms of headgear is kind of an incidental alongside, because we've got an engineering team and we can then recreate those conditions. And it is interesting to look at. There's one headgear unit that's been now allowed through the new law trial. So it's interesting to look at that in particular. But what we're trying to do, and there are other studies, so there's a study gone in Dunedin last year and they're collecting some more data now. There's a study with a high school team up in Gisborne. And what we're doing is creating a database around junior players. So 80% of the players playing in New Zealand are juniors. And we have very little data until now. So what we're trying to do is create a database around that, but specifically around the size, magnitude, and the incidence of collisions.
Just real quick on that as well, we're able to differentiate between forwards and backs. Like positional play at this level is tricky because there's lots of changes, but we will be able to delineate forwards versus backs with our data.
Thank you.
So I've got 3 questions. I've seen some hands go up, one here.
Yeah, maybe a little bit peripheral to your study, but can you talk about the cumulative effect of more than one knock, or people having multiple knocks, or having a second knock when they've already had concussion?
I don't think it's peripheral. I think it's really important and it's related to what we're doing, but I think it's incredibly complex. So when we look at a diagnosis of concussion and how objectively we can do that, there's a researcher in the UK, Tony Belly, who is working out of Birmingham University, and they think they've got microRNA detectors that they can use to almost real time now, I think, make a diagnosis of concussion. But in terms of how we do that in New Zealand and how we do that currently, it's quite complex. And that's with a concussion. But then if we talk about subconcussive knocks and how you define those, that becomes really difficult to do at this stage. I think it's something in terms of the research that's really important to do. And these kind of mouthguards will give us a much better idea and understanding of the size of those collisions. And I think then it links into the work that Danion's doing in terms of the finite element modelling and the potential of that to help us understand brain strain in more detail.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a physio treating concussion specifically. Danion, really interesting that the brainstem's involved, because the vestibular nuclei are encased in the brainstem. And so dizziness, balance problems, those sorts of things come from damage to that area of the brain. And a lot of what I'm treating is dizziness, balance problems, those sorts of things. So I think your research is awesome, really interesting. Thank you.
I've just got a couple of questions and maybe a comment. Firstly, going back to, I think it was Stefan's, one of his slides, it was quite noted, I think it was under the G-forces, that soccer was quite high on one of them. And soccer being a fairly low human-to-human impact, I'm presuming that's hitting the ball.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement. I'm certainly no expert on.
And there's certainly been a lot of long-term issues and professional, over in the Premier League and that in the UK with people getting dementia and things like that.
Right.
The other one was perhaps more of a comment with the American football team also having a high figure. But it's interesting that they're already wearing protective headgear.
Right.
I think most average person who watches a game on television realises just how high the impacts are in those teams, but even with headgear.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a way, I guess they're one step ahead of us, but I hate to see the results without headgear on.
Yes, it's certainly a very high impact game, and the helmet in American football also can be used as a weapon.
That's right.
If they put the head down. But there were changes in American football in terms of at the some of the lower age grades in terms of contact and training, and that seemed to have an impact or flow-on effect in reducing some of the concussion rates, because in American football they do a lot of training.
Yes. And
if you know anything about American football, they have these massive squads, and not a lot of them actually sort of get on the field. So a lot of their concussions actually came from full contact training drills, and that's one thing they've been trying to address. Yeah.
My next question is about the mouth guards themselves, and I'm presuming at certainly at high school level that mouth guards are compulsory.
Yes.
Is there any difference between the size or comfort of an ordinary mouth guard compared with your trial ones?
All I can say is that the players loved them because they were custom fitted, and they didn't slip and they didn't move around. So yeah, we had nothing but positive feedback about the actual day-to-day use of the mouth guards. Yeah.
Interesting things in terms of how the mouth guards work and things like that. So there's in that age group, there's some players that have braces on. And so we had to get the company, and they were really kind and really supportive to us in terms of 3D printing a mouth guard for a player who had braces. Might have gone a sec. And it had braces on and had to go around. So that's something that's tricky in terms of the age group. And then the other one was a player that didn't even know he was doing it, but flicking the mouth guard out and chewing it as they're playing in the game and things like that. And you can see this trace as a result of that. But I've had a parent phone me already this season to ask, can they get their mouth guard from last year back? So I think they're really popular with the players, and they are a really comfortable fit.
But they weren't allowed to keep them.
Yeah.
My last question is the New Zealand Rugby Union keen to trial these at the elite or All Black level, where there are some quite significant impacts.
So
is the New Zealand Rugby Union keen at the elite or All Black level at trialling these new mouth guards?
So that I can say in the Women's Rugby World Cup, most of the teams wore instrumented mouth guards, and the ones that we are using from HeadIQ, the Australian company, the Australian team wore those. So they were wearing them. We've got a separate study that we're doing with the Crusaders, and they're playing in our mouth guards for the 3rd year in a row.
I just was interested in your understanding what you meant by whether the neck was involved or not involved from a physio perspective.
Yeah, so we don't really know exactly what the best way is to recreate some of these impacts, and the neck has a pretty significant effect on the rotational motion. So instead of me going through and trial and error, kind of having a go at it, stab in the dark, I'd rather just have an algorithm guess or look at the trace and guess whether or not a neck should be involved, and then it kind of just gets me closer to the point. But yeah, it does sound kind of funny because obviously there is a neck in real life.
So you're talking about the rotational position of the head on the neck?
Yeah. Well, without a neck, there's not exactly a lot of rotation that can happen. So, when there is this. It's a little flex here.
So it's not talking about side bend or forward bend?
Yeah. Specifically the side bend. There's no rotation without the neck on a side bend in the lab.
So Daniel can recreate with the head form. He can recreate and do drop tests with just the head, or with the head and neck.
More questions?
Hello. My question was just about why you decided to gather both rotational and linear velocity, and like those two metrics, and why they're important in terms of your study. Just to speak to that a little bit more.
For sure. So rotational and linear kind of exist together. You can't really separate them, or not in real life impacts anyway. Rotational we collect because that is pretty much says everything about the damage that occurs to the brain. There's been a bunch of studies that have shown that you can effectively leave out the linear stuff altogether, and it makes no effect on strain within the brain. We just collect linear because everyone else has, really. It's a good metric to have. It's usually pretty nice. It looks a lot nicer in terms of like variation between, in my case, drop tests. And it's a good way to just help compare between the lab and the field. As an easier start. It gets quite complex when you've got rotation because mass affects it quite heavily. Yeah, hopefully that answered it.
Your study numbers might be a bit small, but you mentioned that there were 2 real concussions in the teams that you were observing. Were you able to relate those to particular incidents in the play and your data?
Yeah, so for both of the concussive events, we were able to isolate them on the video. We were able to find them, and as I said before, like every impact will give you all of that information in terms of how big it was, etc. So yeah, we were able to isolate both of those events. Yeah.
And were they particularly large collisions?
They actually weren't. Well, not purely from the numbers. So the one was 26 Gs, and the other one was 14. And one when you're looking on the video, you sort of go, okay, so that's definitely something there. The other one looked fairly innocuous, so it's sort of like what Nick was saying before about how complex this whole situation is. You can very well have a large impact with no concussive injury. You can have a relatively small impact that does result in a concussive injury. So it's a really complex area. But yeah, we do have that information for those two events.
The other bit we've got is post those 2 players. We have post concussion MRI and neurocognitive testing that we've done. So we're in the process of analysing and following through. But it's a very small kind of single case set of studies. There was another. That's in a non-research setting. So when we're not observing and following it as part of a study, that's typically what occurs.
A lot of the concussion diagnosis relies on self-reporting, and there's a lot of psychological stuff to do with players not wanting to. So that accounts for. So when I said other factors as well, there was a lot of stuff that I just kind of skipped over there.
I think that it's a really complex question in terms of there potentially were, yes. But without the diagnosis and the reporting, it's really hard to say on that. And it wouldn't be fair either way to say where that was, but potentially yes.
Wonderful. We're just going to leave it there for now. The glorious thing is these gentlemen are going to be here having a cup of tea and a sausage roll. So if you'd like to stay and keep quizzing. And I think it's really important to remember this work wouldn't be possible without your support. So thank you for all you're doing. We are making life-changing changes to health, and it's all because of you. So tēnā koutou katoa. cold drink, there'll be a bar to help yourself to buy one.